1,000 years, one truth held across Europe. Put a knight in full armor on a warhorse, and nothing on earth could stop him. One armored knight was worth 10 common soldiers. Whoever fielded the most knights won. On a September morning in 1396, on a hillside above the Danube, that truth died, and it died in under an hour. The army that died there was not weak. It was the most expensive fighting force Europe had ever assembled. 20 nations sent their finest. Men trained for war since the age of 10, wearing armor that cost as much as an entire village earned in a year. They rode the most expensive horses on the continent, and every single advantage they carried became the reason they lost. So how does that happen? How does the strongest army of its century, an army that actually outnumbered its enemy on the field, get erased so completely that thousands of its men ended the day kneeling in a row, waiting to be beheaded? Not defeated, erased. The answer is the most uncomfortable kind, because they did it to themselves. Here is what makes this worse than any ordinary defeat. These men were warned. Before the battle, someone laid out exactly how to win, a plan so simple a teenager could follow it. They heard it, they understood it, and they refused, for a reason that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with pride. That refusal is the trap this whole story turns on, because the man waiting for them on that hill had already guessed every move they would make. He built a machine out of the ground itself, designed to do one thing: turn Europe's greatest strength into the thing that killed it. To understand how a trap that perfect was even possible, you have to understand what Europe had refused to see coming for 40 years. In 1396, there was no map like the one you know. Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and feudal lands, and real power belonged to whoever had the biggest army and the hardest will. And the hardest will on the continent did not sit in Paris or Rome. It belonged to a people the Western Knights barely took seriously. That was their first mistake. The Ottoman Empire had started the century as a tiny principality in northwestern Anatolia. Within 70 years, it had become a war machine that ate the Byzantine Empire alive, piece by piece. In 1354, its army crossed into Europe for the first time, and once it had a foothold on European soil, it did not stop, and almost nobody in the West was paying attention. Watch how fast it moved, because the speed is the whole point. In 1361, the Ottomans took Adrianople and made it their European capital. In 1371, a Serbian and Bulgarian alliance shattered against them, 2 Serbian kings drowning as they fled across a river. Each victory was not just a battle won, it was another Christian kingdom swallowed whole. Then came 1389, and the field of Kosovo. This was the day the Balkans truly broke. The alliance of Serbia, Bosnia, Bulgaria, and Albania was smashed. The Serbian Prince Lazar was captured and executed right there on the battlefield. From that moment, Serbia stopped being a kingdom and became something else entirely. It became an Ottoman vassal. Remember that word. It matters later. Add it up. From 1354 to 1389, in just 35 years, the Ottomans took Thrace, Bulgaria, Macedonia, and Serbia, lands that had been the heart of powerful Christian empires. Half of the Balkan Peninsula gone in a single generation. There was nothing in the 14th century moving at that speed, and it was moving straight toward the rest of Europe. By then, only one prize was left in the region, and it was the greatest of all: Constantinople, the largest city in Europe, more than 400,000 people at its peak, the heart of the Byzantine world. Since 1394, the Sultan had it locked inside a ring of siege. But look closely at how he did it, because this tells you exactly the kind of mind Europe was about to face. He did not throw his men at the walls. The walls of Constantinople, built in the 5th century, were too thick and too strong for any weapon he owned, and he knew it. So he did something almost no medieval ruler did. He strangled the city instead, cut the food, blockaded the sea, controlled the countryside, and waited for hunger to do the work no army could. Think about what that patience means. That is 20th century strategic thinking, applied 500 years early. Most rulers of that age wanted the glory of storming a wall. This man wanted the result, and he did not care how long it took or how little glory it earned. If Constantinople starved and fell, the door into the heart of Europe would stand wide open, and one man saw it coming. His name was Sigismund of Luxembourg, the King of Hungary, and he needed nobody to explain the danger to him. Hungary sat right at the edge of everything the Ottomans had already devoured. He had watched Bulgarian refugees pour across his border since 1393. He had read the reports on how this enemy fought, and he understood the one thing the Western Knights never would. Against the Ottomans, courage was not what won, discipline won, tactics won, patience won. In 1395, he wrote to Pope Boniface IX and to the great houses of Western Europe with a warning stripped to the bone. Act now, or within one generation the Ottomans will be at the gates of Vienna, and then something rare in medieval history actually happened. Europe listened. And here I want to ask you to stay with this story, because what we rebuild here is exactly the kind of history this channel exists for, the version the school textbook skips. If that is what you came for, subscribe, because the next part is where the most powerful army of the century starts walking, step by step, toward the worst decision it will ever make. The response came from everywhere at once. The Pope declared a crusade. King Charles VI of France sent his most elite troops. The Duke of Burgundy, a man richer and more powerful than the King of France himself, financed the whole campaign and sent his own son to lead. Knights poured in from Germany, England, Bohemia, Poland, Wallachia, 20 nations, marching under one banner. Somewhere between 12 and 16,000 fighting men gathered, plus thousands more for supply and support. But the numbers are not what made this army historic. It was the quality, and it was the names. This was the single most powerful force of knights assembled anywhere in the entire 14th century. On paper, nothing in the world should have been able to stand against it. On paper. Now meet the man they were marching toward. Bayezid I, son of Murad, and he took his throne in 1389 on the blood-soaked field of Kosovo under circumstances that tell you everything. To eliminate any rival for the crown, he had his own younger brother strangled beside their father's corpse. This was not a man who held illusions about human goodness. He understood power as iron and blood. But the name history gave him did not come from that cruelty. They called him Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, and the name came from speed. In an age when an army marching 20 kilometers in a day was considered fast, Bayezid regularly moved his tens of thousands 50, 60 kilometers a day. He did it through prepared supply lines, iron discipline, and a willingness to sacrifice his own comfort for one thing: speed. And here is what should have terrified the West. Bayezid was not only fast, he was genuinely brilliant, and behind that mind sat a military machine built in 3 layers, each one designed to break a specific part of an enemy. Once you see how the 3 fit together, you understand that Nicopolis was not luck. It was a design, waiting for the right victims to walk into it. The first layer was the Akinci, light cavalry, often volunteers who fought for plunder, wearing no heavy armor and holding no tight formation. And their real job was not to win. Their job was to be bait. They would charge, fire arrows, scream, provoke the enemy into fury, and then pretend to break and flee. It was a 1,000-year-old trick, inherited from the Mongols and perfected. The purpose was to pull the enemy out of safe formation and drag him onto ground the Ottomans had already chosen. Because a charging army that thinks it is winning stops thinking. It stops holding its lines, it follows the fleeing bait straight forward, and it does not look up to ask what is waiting at the top of the hill. Hold that image. You will need it soon. The second layer was the Sipahi, heavy cavalry armored and trained for close combat, the Ottoman answer to the European knight. They held land granted by the Sultan in exchange for military service. It sounds exactly like European feudalism, but there was one difference that changed everything. The land belonged to the Sultan, not to old noble bloodlines. So the Sipahi were loyal to the Sultan, not to their own family names. That difference is bigger than it looks. A European knight fought for his own house, his own glory, his own honor. The Sipahi fought for the empire, and in battle they were positioned on the wings, hidden behind hills and tree lines, waiting with total patience for the single moment the enemy lost his shape. They did not charge for pride. They charged on command, and not 1 second sooner. But it was the third layer that made the Ottomans something Europe had never truly faced: the Janissaries. And to understand them, you have to understand where they came from, because it is one of the most unsettling systems in medieval history. These elite soldiers were not born Ottoman. They were taken as children from the very Christian villages the empire had conquered. Every few years, Ottoman officials walked into the Balkan villages and collected a tax, not in coin, in boys. They took the healthiest and the sharpest, aged 8 to 20, converted them to Islam, and raised them in barracks from childhood. They were taught that the Sultan was their father and the empire was their only family. and they were forbidden the things that make a man divided. No marriage in the early years, no property, no land, no feudal lord to answer to. Stripped of every loyalty a normal man carries, they were left with exactly one thing: absolute loyalty to the Sultan and a discipline that did not break. Think about what that produces. A soldier with nothing to lose and nothing to protect but the man who commands him. That is a weapon. And it was a weapon aimed straight at the weakness Europe did not even know it had. The European knight fought for personal glory, for the story that would be told about him. The Janissary fought as one piece of a single disciplined body, two entire philosophies of war about to collide on one hill. Heroic individualism against collective discipline. Only one of them was going to walk away. Now here is a detail that turns this whole story stranger. Standing with Bayezid commanding 5,000 Serbian heavy cavalry was a devout Orthodox Christian named Stefan Lazarević, and he was the son of Lazar, the very Serbian prince the Ottomans had executed at Kosovo 7 years earlier, a Christian fighting for the man whose empire had killed his father. Why would anyone do that? The answer is not betrayal, it is cold, practical politics. After Kosovo, Serbia had no cards left to play. Becoming an Ottoman vassal meant the country survived, the people lived, the churches stayed open, the nobles kept their land. Refusing meant being wiped off the map entirely, the way Bulgaria had been erased in 1393. Stefan chose survival, and survival meant taking up the sword for his father's killer. Keep those 5,000 Serbian horsemen in the back of your mind, because when the battle comes, they will decide it. Not from the front, where everyone can see them. From a direction no one in the Crusader army will think to guard. For now, they simply wait in the Ottoman rear, invisible, one more piece of a trap that is quietly assembling itself while the West marches on, certain of victory. So in June of 1396, the Great Crusader army gathered at Buda, the capital of Hungary. And if you saw it that day, not knowing how the story ends, you would have called it invincible. At its heart rode Jean de Nevers, 24 years old, heir to the fabulously rich Duchy of Burgundy. He had been handed weapons at the age of 7 and trained for combat since 10. He had never lost anything. Around him rode 4,000 French and Burgundian knights, each man's armor worth as much as a house. There was Philippe d'Artois, Marshal of France, and there was Enguerrand de Coucy, 57 years old, one of the most experienced soldiers in all of France, a man who genuinely understood war. He would give the right advice at the crucial moment, and no one would listen to a word of it. Then add Sigismund's 8,000 Hungarians, plus Wallachian and Transylvanian cavalry, a multinational army with real depth of experience. The problem was never that these men were weak. The problem was something no head count could show you. They were not an army at all. They were a collection of egos marching in the same direction. And that distinction was about to kill almost every one of them. Understand how the feudal system actually worked, because this is the crack the Ottomans would drive a wedge into. A knight owed loyalty to his own direct lord and to no one else. Not to the overall commander of a campaign. Nevers commanded the Burgundians. The Marshal commanded the French. Sigismund commanded the Hungarians. And no single man commanded all of them. So when the army disagreed, and it would, there was no supreme authority to settle it. Instead, whoever carried the greatest reputation, whoever came from the noblest blood, simply won the argument by talking loudest. And at every step of this campaign, the ones who argued loudest were the French. They had crossed a continent for glory, and they were not about to let a Hungarian king tell them how to earn it. The march itself, 800 kilometers from Buda down toward Nicopolis, was a disaster before a single Ottoman came into view. This Crusader army, supposedly marching to protect the Christians of the Balkans, looted and burned and killed the very Christians it had come to save. Local chronicles recorded the scenes. Livestock slaughtered, storehouses emptied, homes burned for entertainment. This was not an army of liberators. And there is a hard military logic underneath the horror, one the Ottomans understood perfectly. An army that devours the supplies along its own route arrives at the battlefield already starving. An army that is never punished for looting is an army that has learned to follow its own appetite instead of orders. On the day of battle, that same army will follow instinct, not command. Bayezid executed his looters without trial. He knew exactly why. In September 1396, the Crusaders finally reached Nicopolis, a fortress guarding the Danube and a key link in the Ottoman defensive chain. Taking it would open the road deeper into Ottoman land. There was just one problem, and it was enormous. They had brought no siege weapons, no catapults, no siege towers, no real engineers. They had come to break walls 3 meters thick with swords and spears. So they did the only thing men with the wrong tools can do. They set up camp and settled in to wait, and here the arrogance stopped being an attitude and became almost a performance. A contemporary French chronicle recorded the scene inside that camp. The French and Burgundian knights held endless drinking feasts, games, and entertainment, as if they were on holiday rather than at war. When rumors began to spread that Bayezid himself was approaching, Jean de Nevers reportedly laughed out loud and declared that even if the sky itself fell, he would not be afraid. That is a real quote, written down in the 14th century. Hold on to it, because it is about to become one of the cruelest lines in this entire story. The sky was, in fact, about to fall on him, because Bayezid was already there. When the Crusaders left Buda in June, they had calmly estimated that the Sultan would need 2, maybe 3 months to gather his forces from across the empire and march them to the Danube. That estimate was not just wrong, it was catastrophically wrong, and it reveals how little they understood the man they had come to fight. Bayezid did it in 6 weeks. He abandoned the siege of Constantinople, even though that siege was in its decisive phase and victory was close, and he drove his army west through Thrace and Bulgaria at a speed that should have been impossible, gathering more men as he went, around 10,000 of them, and he arrived a full month before Sigismund's best guess, the thunderbolt in the most literal sense. That night, Sigismund called an emergency war council, and he laid out a plan that military historians have judged ever since to be completely correct. Let the Wallachian and Transylvanian foot soldiers go first. They knew this terrain. They knew how the Ottomans fought. Let them absorb the first blow and reveal the enemy's shape. The French and Burgundians would wait behind, in reserve. Then, once the Ottomans had fully committed to the front, the heavy cavalry would strike from the flanks and shatter them. This was not cowardice dressed as caution. This was the single correct way to fight an Ottoman army, and it was built on hard experience. Light infantry in front to take the shock. Elite cavalry held back for the exact moment it would matter most. It was, quite simply, the right answer. And the French said no, not because they saw a flaw in the plan, not because they had a better one. They refused for a single reason: honor. Standing in the rear, even in the most tactically vital role on the field, was in their eyes the position of cowards. They had not ridden from Paris to sit behind a line of Wallachian peasants. They had come to lead the charge and to seize the first glory of the day. Picture Sigismund in that moment. He can see the trap on the road ahead as clearly as if it were painted in the sky. He knows precisely what will happen if the knights charge blind, and he has no power at all to stop it, because these men answer to the Pope who called them, not to him. In the iron logic of feudal rank, he cannot command them, so he does the only thing left. He falls silent and he watches. The next morning, the pieces took their places on the board. The French lined up in the vanguard, out in front, exactly as they had demanded. The Hungarians formed up behind them, and across the way on the high ground, Bayezid had already arranged his army with a precision that borders on art. Every element you have been holding in your mind was about to be set into motion. Look at the ground, because the ground is half the trap. South of the city ran a chain of gentle hills with a narrow valley between them. To the north, the Danube cut off any route of retreat. There was nowhere to run, and Bayezid used every fold of that landscape. In front he placed the Akinci, the light cavalry bait, just enough of them to tempt an attack, never enough to hold one. On the hillside, hidden below the crest where no one climbing from the valley could see them, he had a field of sharpened wooden stakes driven deep into the earth, angled forward, waiting. And behind those stakes, lying flat against the ground, completely invisible from below, waited rows of Janissary archers. Everything the French were about to charge into was concealed by the curve of a hill. On both wings, tucked behind the slopes, the Sipahi heavy cavalry waited for their order. And far to the rear, at the highest point, sat Bayezid himself with his personal Janissary guard and the full reserve watching. Out to the east, out of sight of everyone, waited Stefan's 5,000 Serbian horsemen. The whole machine was set. All it needed now was for Europe's greatest knights to do exactly what everyone knew they would do. And this is the genius of it. the thing that lifts Bayezid above every ordinary commander. He was not defending that hill. He was baiting his own front line, offering it up, designing the entire forward position to collapse on purpose. The bait, the stakes, the hidden archers, it was all one mechanism with a single function. Make Europe's armored cavalry charge uphill, exhaust itself, lose its shape, and then be destroyed by fresh troops it never saw. Mid-morning, it began, the Akinci rode out, close enough to provoke, far enough to stay safe. They loosed their arrows, they shouted their insults, and the moment the French cavalry began forming into an attack line, the Akinci did exactly what they were built to do. They broke into apparent chaos and fled back toward the hill, and Jean de Nevers, seeing an enemy running, gave the order he had crossed a continent to give: charge. Thousands of war horses, some approaching 700 kilograms and partly clad in iron, carrying knights in 30 kilograms of armor, surged forward at once. The ground shook. The sound of the hooves was like rolling thunder. Dust rose and swallowed the light. The Akinci ahead of them were trampled or scattered, the first Ottoman line simply dissolving before the charge, exactly as Bayezid had drawn it up. And the French cheered. Of course they did. The enemy was breaking, the line was collapsing, victory looked as though it lay just ahead at the top of the slope. So they drove their exhausted horses on, up the hillside, chasing the fleeing bait, certain they were moments from winning. Not one of them understood that every stride uphill was carrying them deeper into a machine built specifically to kill them. Near the top, the charge slammed into something that stopped it dead. A forest of sharpened stakes planted at an angle, packed so tightly that no horse could pass without being driven through the chest, and it could not be gone around. The stake field stretched across the entire width of the hilltop, edge to edge. The cavalry, which lives and dies by momentum, was forced to halt, and a halted heavy cavalry is a dead heavy cavalry. That was the instant the Janissaries stood up. Hundreds of archers who had been lying flat behind the stakes, invisible until this heartbeat, rose together and began firing at ranges sometimes as short as 30 meters. Arrows drove through the gaps in armor, through the unprotected necks of the horses. Wounded animals reared and threw their riders, and a knight in 30 kilograms of steel, once he is on the ground, cannot simply stand back up. The knights who tried to dismount and pick their way through the stakes on foot were shot the entire way. Understand what this actually was. It was not a battle in the sense of two forces testing each other. It was a machine running its program. The stakes stop the cavalry. The archers destroy the stopped cavalry. The exhaustion of the climb finishes whatever is still moving, every part performing the exact function it was designed for. From his seat on the high ground, Bayezid watched his machine do precisely what he had calculated, and while the French were pinned against the stakes, dying under the rain of arrows, he delivered the next blow. From behind both slopes, the Sipahi heavy cavalry burst out at the same instant, charging into the trapped knights from the left and the right at once. Now the jaws closed. And this was the moment the truth finally reached the French. They were not standing on the summit of victory. They were standing in the center of a trap. Pinned at the front by archers, they could not reach behind a wall they could not cross. Struck on both flanks by fresh, heavy cavalry, exhausted from the climb, and with no reserve behind them because the Hungarians they had refused to fight beside were still down in the valley. The finest knights in Western Europe began to fall. Jean de Nevers, the young man who had laughed at the falling sky, was pulled down and captured alive. Philippe d'Artois, Marshal of France, was killed. Enguerrand de Coucy, the one man who had warned them all, was captured and would later die of illness while waiting for his ransom to be paid. The battle against the French line was over in less than an hour. The force considered the very finest in Western Europe had been wiped out so fast that Sigismund, back in the valley, barely had time to grasp what was happening. Everything he had feared in that silent war council was unfolding in front of him at brutal speed. But Sigismund did not run. He gathered the Hungarians and Germans, the men who had been held out of the first catastrophe, and led them forward to try to save the day. And for a short, precious window, it almost worked. The Hungarians pushed forward with real force. Several Ottoman units were driven back. For a few moments on that hillside, the outcome of the whole battle genuinely hung in the balance, and it was not at all certain that Bayezid would win. The Sultan, watching from above, saw the danger, and he reached for the last piece on his board. He gave the signal to the east, and from a place no one in the Crusader army had any idea was occupied, Stefan Lazarevich's 5,000 Serbian heavy cavalry came thundering out. They drove straight into the Hungarian right wing, a flank already strained, already exhausted, and completely unprotected from that direction. This was the blow that ended it, and it worked not because of numbers, but because of where it came from. This is a truth about war worth sitting with. The Serbs did not win by weight. They won by surprise, by striking from the one direction no one had prepared to defend, at the exact moment the Hungarians were already at their limit, and by arriving as a completely fresh force against exhausted men. The psychological shock of an attack from an unexpected side can break a formation that raw strength alone never could. Because armies do not actually collapse when they run out of men. They collapse when they run out of will. And the Hungarians had now been hit from every direction at once. They had watched their French allies annihilated. They had fought all morning. And now they were being struck from the one side they had believed was safe. Something inside the formation simply gave way. And once it gives way, it cannot be rebuilt. King Sigismund watched his battle line dissolve from his command position. The officers around him began to plead with him to leave. He was the king. He was the one man who could not be allowed to fall, because if Hungary lost him at this moment, it would lose its leader when it needed one most. So Sigismund boarded a small boat on the Danube and escaped downriver, and behind him, on the shore, the massacre began. Bayezid had won, but when he walked across that battlefield the next morning, he did not see a clean and glorious victory. He saw the enormous cost of it written across the ground in his own dead. Modern historians estimate the Ottomans also lost somewhere from several thousand to more than 10,000 men. The exact figure will never be known. But it was enough to make a normally cold and controlled sultan genuinely furious. And then he learned what the Crusaders had done before the battle. In earlier skirmishes they had taken Ottoman prisoners, and fearing those captives would cause trouble in the camp once the main fight began, they had killed hundreds of them. When Bayezid heard this, he gave an order of his own. From morning into the afternoon of September 26th, thousands of Christian prisoners were brought before him and executed. The ones who were spared were the lords wealthy enough to be worth a ransom. Jean de Nevers and a handful of other important names were eventually released, but for some so enormous they drained the treasuries of France and Burgundy for years afterward. The men without rich families to buy their lives back did not have that option. They died on that ground, in a row under the Balkan sky. You can condemn Bayezid for this, and many have, but said it in the 14th century honestly. Killing prisoners was not unusual in that age. Both sides did it. The Crusaders themselves had just done it. What truly set Nicopolis apart was never the brutality of its ending. Every war had brutality. What set it apart was the sheer scale of the defeat and the reason behind it. That is the part that changed history. Because when the news reached Paris in October 1396, Europe was not just grieving, it was stunned into a terrible realization. Strategists across the continent began pulling the battle apart, and slowly they arrived at a truth none of them wanted to face. Their entire model of war was obsolete. The thing they had built their whole military world around no longer worked, and Nicopolis had proven it in front of everyone. The feudal knightly system rested on one basic assumption: heavy armored cavalry was the supreme weapon on any field. One knight could defeat 5, even 10 ordinary infantry, so whoever had the most knights would win. It had been true for centuries, and Nicopolis showed without mercy that it was true no longer. Charge armored cavalry into a trap, break its formation, exhaust it, and shoot it at close range, and it dies like anything else. The lesson underneath was not brand new, but Nicopolis was the first time disciplined elite infantry, using a systematic plan, destroyed the finest knightly army in Europe under conditions that should have favored the cavalry perfectly. The Janissaries did the thing everyone had believed impossible. They stood firm in front of a charge of armored knights, because the stakes held the knights back, and because they had been trained, from childhood, never to run. And the consequences reached far past the dead on that field. The Balkans now became an inseparable part of the Ottoman world, and they would stay that way for 500 years into the 19th and 20th centuries. Hungary had just lost its last real chance to stop the Ottoman advance into Central Europe. The door Sigismund had warned about was now truly open. But there is one more consequence, and it is the one almost no one talks about. Something changed in the mind of Europe itself. The crusade was never again the glamorous adventure of the aristocracy, the golden expedition where noble blood went to win noble glory. Nicopolis was the final bell tolling on that entire age. The medieval world of the crusading knight had just heard the date of its own ending. Now follow what happened to the men who lived, because the ironies here are almost too perfect to be real. Jean de Nevers, held prisoner for nearly a year, was finally released for a ransom of up to 200,000 gold florins, a sum so staggering his father had to tax his lands for years to raise it. He would go on to become Duke John I of Burgundy, and history remembers him by a nickname, John the Fearless. Sit with that for a moment. The man history calls fearless is the same man who at Nicopolis made the fatal mistake precisely because he did not know fear. His courage was never the problem. His courage, untempered by a single ounce of caution, was the weapon the Ottomans used to destroy an entire army. The name that was meant to honor him is, if you look closely, the exact diagnosis of what went wrong. The others scattered into their own fates. Sigismund survived, ruled Hungary for nearly 40 more years, became Holy Roman Emperor, and carried the lesson of that hillside for the rest of his life. Bayezid, the Thunderbolt himself, was captured alive by Timur just 6 years later, in 1402, and died in captivity. And Stefan, the son who fought for his father's killer to save his people, became one of the greatest rulers medieval Serbia ever knew. So stand on that quiet hill above the Danube today, where a few old stones are all that remain, and the truth of it is still written in the ground. In 1396, two worlds collided here. One believed that glory and courage and noble blood were enough to win. The other believed in discipline, planning, and cold patience. 5,000 men died learning which was right. If a story told the way it actually happened is what you're here for, subscribe and I'll keep rebuilding them.